Chapter 6 of The Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 6. That same day I had an appointment to lunch with the owner of rich hotels whose story I was writing, and the interview dragged. For the America he knew was like what I'd seen on the upper decks of the ship that had sailed a few hours before. And I could not get back my old zest for it all. I kept thinking of what I had seen underneath. The faces of individual stokers, some fiery red, some sodden gray, kept bobbing up in my memory. Angrily trying to keep them down, I went on with my questions. But I caught the hotel millionaire throwing curious looks at me now and then. I went home worried and depressed and shut myself up in my workroom. This business had to be thought out. It wasn't only stokers. It was something deep, worldwide. I had come up against the slums. What had I to do with it all? I was in my room all afternoon. I heard the Indian at my door, but I sat still and silent, and presently he went away. Late in the twilight Eleanore came. How beautiful she was tonight. She was wearing a soft gown of silk, blue with something white at her throat, and a brooch that I had given her. As she bent over my shoulder I felt her clean, fresh loveliness. "Don't you want to tell me, love, just what it was he showed you?" "I'd rather not, my dear one. It was something so terribly ugly," I said. "I don't like being so far away from you, dear. Please tell me. Suppose you begin at the start." It took a long time, for she would let me keep nothing back. "I wouldn't have thought it could hit me so hard," I said at the end. "I'm not surprised," said Eleanore. "I can't be simply angry at Joe," I went on. "He's so intensely and gauntly sincere. It isn't just talk with him, you see, as it is with Sue's parlor radical friends. Think of the life he's been leading. Think of it compared to mine. Joe and I were mighty close once." I broke off and got up restlessly. "I hate to think of him," I said. "It's funny," said Eleanore quietly. "I knew this was coming sooner or later. Ever since we've been married, I've known that Joe Kramer still means more to you than any man you've ever met." "He doesn't," I said sharply. "Where on earth did you get that idea?" "From you, my love," she answered. "You can't dream how often you've spoken about him." I didn't know I had. It is most disquieting at times, the things Eleanore tells me about myself. "I know you don't," she continued. "You do it so unconsciously. That's why I'm so sure he has a real place in the deep unconscious part of you. He worries you. He gets you to think you've no right to be happy." There was a bitterness in her voice that I had never heard before. "I believe in helping people, of course, whenever I get the chance," she said. "But I don't believe in this. I hate it. It's simply an insane attempt to pull every good thing down. It's too awful even to think of it." "We're not going to," I told her. "I'm sorry for Joe, and I wish I could help him out of his hole. But I can't. It's too infernally deep. He won't listen to any talk from me, and as long as he won't, I'll leave him alone. It's hideous enough, God knows. But if I ever tackle poverty and labor and that sort of thing, it'll be along quite different lines." The doorbell rang. "Oh, Billy," she said, "I forgot to tell you. Father's coming to dinner tonight." I looked at her a moment. "Did you ask him here on my account?" Eleanore smiled frankly. "Yes. I thought I might need him," she said. I did not talk to her father of Joe. His plans for a strike were his secret, not mine. But with Eleanore pushing me on, I described the hell I had seen in the stokehole. "You're right, it's hell," her father agreed. "But in time we'll do away with it." "I knew it," Eleanore put in. "How?" I asked. "By using oil instead of coal, or if we can't get oil cheap enough, by automatic stokers, machines to do the work of men." I thought hard and fast for a moment, and suddenly I realized that I had never given any real thought to matters of this kind before. "Then what will become of the stokers?" I asked him. "One thing at a time. I caught Dillon keenly watching me over his cigar. "Don't give up your faith in efficiency, Bill. If they'll only give us enough time, we'll be able to do so much for men." There was something so big and sincere in his voice and in his clear and kindly eyes. "I'm sure you will," I answered. "If you don't, there's nobody else who can." In a week or two, by grinding steadily on at my work, and by a few more quiet talks with Eleanore and her father, I could feel myself safely back on my ground. But one morning Sue broke in on me. "I've just heard from a friend of Joe Kramer's," she said, "that he is dangerously ill, and there's no one to look after him. Hadn't you better go yourself?" "Of course," I answered gruffly. "I'll go down at once." It seemed as though the fates and Sue were in league to keep Joe in my life. I went to Joe's office and found the address of the room where he slept. It was over a German saloon close by. It was a large, low-ceilinged room, bare and cheaply furnished, with dirty curtains at the windows, dirty collars and shirts on the floor. It was cold. In the high, old-fashioned fireplace the coal fire had gone out. Joe was lying dressed on the bed. He jumped up as I entered and came to me with his face flushed and his eyes dilated. He gripped my hand. "Well, hello, kid," he cried. "Glad to see you." And then with a quick drop of his voice, "Hold on. We mustn't talk so loud. We've got to be quiet here, you know." He turned away from me restlessly. "I've been hunting for hours for that damn book. Their cataloging system here is rotten, kid. It's rotten." As he spoke he was slowly feeling his way along the dirty white wall of his room. "They've cheated us, Bill. I'm on to 'em now. That's what college is really for these days, to hide the books we ought to read." It came over me suddenly that Joe was back in college, on one of those library evenings of ours. I felt a tightening at my throat. "Say, Joe," I drew him toward the bed, "the chapel bell has just struck 10. Time for beer and pretzels." "Fine business. Gee, but I've got a thirst. But where's the door? God damn it all, I can't find anything tonight." He laughed unsteadily. "Right over here," I answered. "Steady, old man." And so I got him to bed. He fell down on it, breathing hard, and I brought him a drink of water. He began to shiver violently. I covered him up with dirty blankets, went down to the bar-room and telephoned to Eleanore. Too deeply disturbed to think very clearly, acting on an impulse, I told her of Joe's condition and asked if I might bring him home. "Why, of course," came the answer, a little sharp. "Wait a moment. Let me think." There was a pause, and then she added quietly, "Go back to his room and keep him in bed. I'll see that an ambulance comes right down." Within an hour after that Joe was installed in our guest room with a trained nurse to attend to him. The doctor pronounced it typhoid, and he was with us for 9 weeks. The effect upon our lives was sharp. In our small crowded apartment all entertaining was suddenly stopped, and with the sole exception of Sue no one came to see us. Even our little Indian learned to be quiet as a mouse. Our whole home became intense. Through the thin wall of my workroom I could hear Joe in his delirium. Now he was busily writing letters. Now in a harsh, excited voice he was talking to a crowd of men. Again he was furiously shoveling coal. All this was incoherent, only mutterings most of the time. But when the voice rose suddenly it was so full of a stern pain, so quivering with revolt against life, and it poured out such a torrent of commonplace, minute details that showed this was Joe's daily life and the deepest part of his being, that, as I listened at my desk, the ghost I thought I had buried deep, that vague, guilty feeling over my own happiness, came stealing up in me again. And it was so poignant now, that struggle angrily as I would to plunge again into my work, I found it impossible to describe the life in those rich, gay hotels with the zest and the dash I needed to make my story a success. But it had to be a success, for we needed money badly. The expenses of Joe's sickness were already rolling in. So I did finish it at last, and took it to my successful man, who read it with evident disappointment. It was not the glory story that I had led him to expect. My magazine editor said he would use it, but he too appeared surprised. "You weren't up to your usual form," was his comment. "What's the matter?" "A sick friend." I started another story at once, one I had already planned, about a man who was to build a string of gorgeous opera houses in the leading American cities. This story, too, went slowly. Joe Kramer's voice kept breaking in. From time to time, as I struggled on, I could feel Eleanore watching me. "Don't try to hurry it," she said. "We can always borrow from father, you know. And besides, I'm going to cut our expenses." She was as good as her word. She dismissed the nurse, and through the last weeks of delirium and the first of returning consciousness, she placed herself in Joe's borderland as the one whose presence he vaguely felt pulling him back into comfort and strength. "Now don't talk," I heard her say to him one evening. "I don't want to hear you. All I want is to get you well. That's the only thing you and I have to talk of." But having so thrown him off his guard, as his mind grew clearer, she began cautiously drawing him out, despite his awakening hostility to this woman who had made me a success. From my room I heard snatches of their talk. She surprised J.K. by the intimate bits of knowledge about him that she had collected, both from me and from his own sick ramblings. She had just enough of his point of view to rouse him from his indifference, to annoy him by her mistakes and her refusals to understand. I remember one afternoon when I went in to sit with him, his staring grimly up at my face and saying, "Bill, that wife of yours is such a born success she scares me. Everything she touches, everything she brings me to drink, everything she does to this bed, is one thundering success. And she won't listen to anything but success. Your case is absolutely hopeless." They became grim enemies, and both of them enjoyed it. She let our small son come and sit by the bed. The Indian promptly worshipped Joe as the longest man he had ever seen, and they became boon companions. "It's pathetic," Eleanore told me, "the little things that appeal to him here. Poor boy, he has forgotten what a decent home is like." As he grew stronger she read the paper to him each morning, and they quarreled with keen relish over the news events of the day. And, as at the start, so now, she kept giving him little shocks of surprise by her intimate glimpses into his views. On one of these occasions, after she had come out from his room and was sitting by me reading, "You're a wonder, Eleanore," I said. "I don't see how you've done it." "Done what, my love?" asked Eleanore. "Wormed all his views out of poor old Joe." "I haven't done anything of the sort. I've learned over half of it from Sue. She comes here often nowadays, and we have long talks about him. Sue seems to know him rather well." This did not interest me much, so I switched our talk to something that did. "What bothers me," I said with a scowl, "is this infernal work of mine." "What are you smiling at?" I asked. "Nothing," she murmured, beginning to read. "But if I were you, I'd stick at my work. You're good at that." "Not now, I'm not," I retorted. "This story about the opera man isn't coming on at all. The more I work, the worse it gets." "It will get better soon," she said. "I'm not so sure. Do you know what I think is the matter with me? I was in to-day, looking at Joe asleep, and watching the lines in that face of his, it came over me all of a sudden what a wretched coward I've been." Eleanore looked up suddenly. "I know there's something in all his talk. I've known it every time we've met. His view's so distorted that it makes me mad. But there's something in it you can't get away from. Poverty, that's what it is, and I've always steered away clear of it as though I were afraid to look. I've taken your father's point of view and left the slums for him and his friends to tackle when they get the time. I was only too glad to be left out, but that hour with J.K. and his stokers gave me a jolt. I can feel it still. I can't seem to shake it off. And I'm beginning to wonder now why I shouldn't get up the nerve to see for myself, to have a good big look at it all, and write about it for a while." "Don't," said Eleanore. "Leave it alone." Her voice was so sharp it startled me. "Why?" I rejoined. "You've tackled poverty often enough. I guess I can stand it, if you can." "You're different," she answered. "You leave poverty alone and force yourself to go on with your work. You've made a very wonderful start. You'll be ready to take up fiction soon. When you have, and when you have gone so far that you feel sure of your name and yourself, then you can look at whatever you like." I wonder what Joe would say to that. I know what he'll say. He'll agree with me. Why don't you ask him and see for yourself? I'm beginning to like Joe Kramer," she added with a quiet smile, "because now that I understand him, I know that his life and yours are so far apart you've hardly a point in common." And in the talks I had with Joe this soon proved to be the case. Eleanore brought us together now, and listened with deep satisfaction as we clashed and jarred each other apart. His old indifferent manner was gone. He was softened, grateful for what we had done. But he held to that view of his like a rock, and the view entirely shut me out. Joe saw society wholly as war sure, between two classes, and I was hopelessly on the wrong side. My work, my home, and my whole life were bound in with the upper class, and there could be no middle ground. My boasted tolerance, breadth of mind, my readiness to see both sides, my passion for showing up all men as human, this, to Joe, was utter piffle. He had no use for such writing, or, in fact, for art of any kind. Propaganda was all that he wanted, and that could be as cheap as Nick Carter, as sentimental as Uncle Tom's Cabin, if only it had the kind of punch that would reach to the mass of ignorant workers and stir their minds and their passions into swift and bitter revolt. Revolution! That was the thing. The world had come to a time, he said, when talking and writing weren't going to count. We were entering into an age of force, of direct action, strikes and the like, by prodigious masses of men. All I could do was worthless. These talks made me so indignant and sore, so sure that Joe and all his work were utterly wild and that only in Dillon and his kind lay any hope of solving the dreary problems of the slums, that within a few days more I was delving into my opera man with a most determined approval. He, at least, was a builder. He didn't want to tear everything down. In his every scheme for a huge success I took now an aggravated delight. All my recent tolerance gone, I threw into my work an intensity that I had not felt in months. And Eleanore smiled contentedly, as though she knew what she was about. When at last the time came for Joe to leave, she was twice as friendly to him as I. End of chapter 6. Recording by Tom Weiss.